He didn't say a word as he left the courtroom. No dramatic statement. No glance toward the cameras. Just a flash of tension in his jaw, a heavy silence in his posture. Then the door closed behind him. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And with that, it was over. But what exactly did Prince Harry lose? And more importantly, why does it matter now, more than ever before? Let's take a breath here. Because we're not talking about another celebrity tiff or a headline to scroll past. No, this is different. This was the final round of a legal battle that Prince Harry once called the crusade of his life. His stand against Britain's tabloid culture. A fight he said wasn't just about him, but about protecting his family, his children, from the same flashing cameras that chased his mother down that Paris tunnel. But on Monday, in the UK's highest court, it ended not with a statement, but with a ruling, one that hit harder than many expected. And if you watched closely, there was a shift in the room. Not loud, not explosive, but you could feel it, the quiet disintegration of hope. Now here's the thing. Prince Harry has faced and initiated multiple lawsuits against major media houses. Phone hacking, data theft, unlawful surveillance, the list is long. But this was supposed to be the clean shot, the final reckoning. The case that would force the British judiciary to acknowledge, in black and white, the pattern of abuse and the trail of damage. But instead, it fizzled. Or worse, it failed. And yet, it's not the loss itself that's reverberating through royal watchers and legal analysts alike. It's the way it happened. Because here's what we're hearing. The judges didn't outright reject the idea that wrongdoing may have occurred. But they weren't willing to extend the law far enough to accommodate Harry's expectations. That distinction, it's crucial, and it's crushing. What does that say about justice? What does it say about power? And perhaps the harder question, what does it say about Prince Harry himself? Because if this really was the final card in his legal hand, what does he do now? More lawsuits? Public appeals? Or something more unthinkable? We'll get there, but not all at once. Because there's something else no one is talking about. A moment in that courtroom, just before the ruling. A look exchanged. A tightening of fingers. A subtle cue between lawyers that, according to someone in the room, signaled that they knew. They knew the decision wasn't going to go their way, and they knew what it meant. So the question becomes, why did Prince Harry come back, knowing the odds? What was he really fighting for? And how much of this was about the law versus proving something else? Something personal. We'll unpack what happened inside that courtroom. The clues, the contradictions, the collapse. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It wasn't just a return to London. It was a return to the lion's den. But why now? Why walk back into the same arena that has twisted your image for years, reshaped your narrative into something unrecognizable, and, by all accounts, refused to listen the first time? Why risk everything? Because that's what this was. A risk. Not a ceremonial appearance, not a calculated PR move. Prince Harry came back to fight. But even before he stepped into the courtroom, the cracks were already showing. You could see it in the way his legal team huddled that morning. Close, tense, whispering, not in strategy, but in restraint. You could feel it in the crowd outside, less supportive, more skeptical. And you could sense it in Harry himself. The shoulders weren't squared this time. The eyes didn't scan the press. This wasn't defiance. It was something quieter. A man walking into what might be his final shot at being heard. And the location? The UK's highest court. Not a place for spectacle. No flashing lights. No crossfire. Just precedent, procedure, and protocol. Three things that rarely play well with emotion. But that's what made this moment strange, because everything about Harry's battle was emotional. His testimony in earlier trials was raw, even confessional. He called the press the enemy, accused them of destroying lives, manipulating headlines, surveilling him illegally. He spoke about Meghan, about Diana, about trauma. This was more than litigation, it was catharsis. And yet, this court wasn't built for catharsis. It doesn't recognize grief as evidence. So the question hangs, was Harry prepared for that? Or was he hoping this court, unlike the tabloids, might finally listen? But maybe that's the contradiction no one wanted to admit. That Prince Harry was asking the very institution he had come to distrust, to now defend him, to validate his experience, to tell the public he wasn't paranoid, he was right. That contradiction doesn't hold for long, because behind those walls, The judges weren't interested in personal redemption. They were measuring law, statute, historical precedent. And the moment arguments began, it was clear they weren't bending. Still, Harry sat, listened, waited, maybe hoping for a flicker of recognition, a question that leaned his way. But it didn't come. And when the courtroom took its first break, that's when something subtle, almost imperceptible, shifted. One of the barristers leaned in, just slightly. No notes, no folders, just a brief exchange of eyes, then the glance downward. It was enough, because Harry didn't stand right away. He sat still, jaw tight, hands folded. But something had left the room. And what followed wasn't part of the script. What followed wasn't planned. What do you do when you realize they've already made up their minds? That's the weight that settled into the courtroom like dust after a slammed door. Not a moment of drama, no raised voices, just an unmistakable shift. One that legal professionals recognize instinctively. When the tone turns procedural, when the faces at the bench go still, that's when you know the law is moving on without you. And that's exactly what it felt like, sitting in that chamber with Prince Harry on one side of the room, his team silent and unreadable, and across from them, a judiciary that had already begun to pull away. Because here's the thing. Courts, especially at this level, are not moved by passion. They're not designed to empathize. They're designed to interpret, detached, disciplined, and at times, cold. It's how precedent survives. But Harry wasn't built for detachment. Not in this fight. This case wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. His written submission spoke of betrayal, invasion, psychological harm. He wasn't asking for sympathy, not directly, but he was asking for acknowledgement. He wanted someone in power to say, yes, you were wronged. You were watched. You were manipulated. But that isn't what the law gave him. The judges, by all reports, remained focused. Clinical. They didn't dispute the possibility that the press had overstepped in the past. But they questioned whether this specific claim, this final battle, met the legal burden of proof. Had it come too late? Did it rely on assumptions? Was it built on circumstantial inferences rather than hard evidence? They weren't debating morality. They were defining boundaries. And this is where the tension thickened. Because across the aisle, Harry's team began leaning harder into language, into ethics, patterns of abuse, a broader cultural sickness in the tabloid system. But the judges narrowed their gaze, as if to say, that's not why we're here. And if you were watching carefully, you could see the discomfort rise. The way Harry shifted in his chair. The small, tightening movement in his jaw. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't gesturing. But there was something in his posture, something unsettled. A recognition, maybe, that the emotional core of his argument was dissolving under legal scrutiny. And then it happened. One of the justices asked a question. Brief. Technical. But it landed like a blow. Because the question wasn't about truth, it was about timing. Whether this case, valid or not, had come too late to matter. And Harry looked down, not in defeat, but in something worse. Disbelief. Because in that moment, it hit him. The court wasn't doubting that harm occurred. They were doubting whether they could still care. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of exit that says more than words ever could. When the ruling came down. Dry, procedural, delivered in the neutral cadence of a system trained to never flinch. Prince Harry didn't react. At least, not in the way some expected. No outburst. No flash of anger. Just stillness. But the silence was sharp. Because this wasn't just another unfavorable ruling. This was final. The end of a legal arc that had stretched for years, across continents, across headlines, through layers of emotional and psychological terrain. And when the justices confirmed that they would not expand legal protections as Harry had hoped, would not, in fact, alter the legal framework around press intrusion, it became clear. The system had spoken, and it wasn't going to bend. Not for a prince. Not for a husband. Not even for a son trying to avenge what the cameras once did to his mother. The walkout wasn't rushed. But it wasn't deliberate, either. It was abrupt. Like something internal had given way. Harry left the courtroom before the reporters even registered it. 1 second he was seated behind the table, surrounded by a wall of paper and quiet murmurs. The next, he was gone. Some described the look on his face as thunderous. Others said it was hollow. But here's the part no one can quite agree on. What does this mean? Because if this was the last major attempt to hold the media legally accountable for what Harry sees as years of surveillance, manipulation, and psychological warfare, then the door has just been closed. And maybe locked. He can appeal, yes. But insiders say the odds are razor thin. And even if he tried to refile under a different claim, well, the appetite from the judiciary is waning. That's the quiet part. The part not in the judgment, but between the lines. So where does that leave him? That's the real question. If the courts are no longer an option, if legal mechanisms have proven insufficient or unwilling to address what Harry insists is a pattern of systemic violation, what's left? A return to public campaigns? Media exposés? Or worse, a full withdrawal from institutional engagement altogether? Because here's what one source close to the case quietly hinted at, off record. The plan was never to walk away. But after this verdict, Harry may be forced to. And if that happens, if Prince Harry truly turns his back on the British system, then what happens next won't be confined to courtrooms. He came to the courtroom looking for judgment. And he got it. But maybe not the kind he was prepared for. Because this wasn't just a legal decision. It was a statement delivered without emotion, stripped of context, and intentionally devoid of sympathy. That's how the courts operate. They don't speak in metaphors. They don't weigh heartbreak. They look at what the law permits, not what it owes. And that, right there, might be the sharpest edge of this entire story. Because Prince Harry wasn't just asking for damages or privacy or precedent. He was asking for recognition. Not from the public, not from the press, but from the very system he believes failed him and his mother. And in return, the system responded with a shrug. Now, to be clear, the ruling doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't absolve the tabloids. It doesn't say he was lying. In fact, it doesn't say much at all beyond this. Your claim came too late. Your evidence didn't meet our threshold. The law does not move just because you need it to. And that leaves us with silence. Not the silence of dignity. The silence of something unresolved. So where does Prince Harry go from here? Will he escalate publicly? Retreat quietly? Or, as some are whispering behind closed doors, will he finally step back from the legal arena entirely? Because when a man exhausts every formal route to defend his truth, what's left? Do you take it to the press you once fought? Do you write another memoir? Do you disappear? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are real choices staring him in the face. And whatever he chooses next, it won't just define him, it'll echo. Across institutions, across his family, across public opinion. And maybe, just maybe, this loss wasn't the end of a war. Maybe it was the beginning of a quieter, more dangerous kind of confrontation. One that doesn't take place in courtrooms or headlines, but in whispers. Between power and consequence. Between truth and what's allowed to survive. So now we're left with the question. If the courts no longer believe they can help, who does he turn to next? And more hauntingly, who's still willing to listen? If you've been following this case, or if you have thoughts about what this ruling really means. Not just for Prince Harry, but for privacy, for institutions, and for legacy, leave a comment. Tell us what you saw that others might have missed. And if you want to follow what comes next, because this story is far from over, make sure you're subscribed. Because the silence, it's only just begun.